In the deep silence of a medieval monastery, a lone monk hunches over a desk in the cold scriptorium. His world is reduced to the tip of a quill, the smooth surface of vellum, and the slow, deliberate formation of each letter. To copy a single Bible is his life's work, a task of such immense physical and spiritual weight that it might consume a year, or even a lifetime. The air is thick with the scent of ink and old parchment, a sacred space where knowledge is not created but painstakingly preserved, one character at a time. This single illuminated manuscript is not merely a book, it is a holy relic, a vessel of divine authority. Its scarcity is the source of its power. For a village or even a city to possess one was a mark of profound wealth and status. The words within were not meant for common eyes, but were to be transmitted by those few who could read them, cementing a world order built on the careful restriction of a sacred text. This was a reality where information was a treasure, locked away in stone vaults and guarded by a consecrated elite. This system was no accident. It was a masterful architecture of informational control. For 1,000 years, the power of the Church in Europe was not founded solely on faith, but on its absolute monopoly over the production, distribution, and most critically, the interpretation of texts. By controlling the scripture, the legal codes, and the historical records, they controlled the very framework of reality. They were the gatekeepers of knowledge, and through those gates, they shaped the soul of a continent. The consequence of this structure was a unified, stable, and deeply hierarchical world. The local priest was the unquestioned conduit to God because he was the one who could read the sacred manuscript. Kings were crowned with divine right, legitimized by documents held and interpreted by the Church. For the common person, the universe was a closed system, its rules defined and explained by an authority whose foundation was unreachable and unchallengeable. But then, a question emerged from the workshops of Mainz, a question so profound it bordered on heresy. What if you could create 1,000 Bibles in the time it took that one monk to create a single copy? What happens to the power of the gatekeeper when the gate itself is suddenly and irrevocably blown from its hinges? This was not a question about efficiency or technology, it was a question about the very nature of power. To ask this question was to challenge the central pillar supporting a millennium of European order. If knowledge could be replicated cheaply and quickly, it could no longer be contained. If anyone could own the sacred texts, who then had the authority to interpret them? The unthinkable question did not just propose a new tool, it proposed a new world, one where power might flow not from a single guarded source, but from 1,000 and then 1,000,000 different points. The man who gave this question its physical form was Johannes Gutenberg, but he was not a lone inventor visited by a flash of genius. He was a brilliant and strategic integrator, a master craftsman who saw the convergence of separate technologies. In his workshop, he brought together the raw, crushing force of the wine press, a tool of agriculture, and repurposed it for a new, intellectual harvest. He combined this brute strength with the meticulous precision of metallurgy. His true innovation was the creation of a hand mold that could cast vast quantities of uniform, durable, and movable metal type. Finally, he perfected an oil-based ink, a specific chemical formula that would adhere to the cold metal type and transfer cleanly to paper, unlike the water-based inks of the scribes. Each element was a crucial piece of a complex puzzle. When Gutenberg produced his first Bibles around 1455, his ambition was not to create something new, but to perfectly replicate the old. His printed pages were designed to mimic the majestic beauty of a hand-illuminated manuscript, complete with intricate lettering and space for artistic flourishes. This was a strategic choice, meant to prove that his mechanical process could equal the sacred art of the scribe. The weapon had been forged, but its true revolutionary potential lay dormant, waiting for a catalyst. That catalyst arrived in 1517 on the heavy oak door of the castle church in Wittenberg. A fiery theology professor named Martin Luther, enraged by what he saw as corruption within the church, nailed a document to the door, his 95 Theses. The sound of his hammer was an act of academic defiance, a call for scholarly debate written in the formal language of Latin. In the old world of the manuscript, this act would have remained just that, a local dispute, debated by a handful of theologians and ultimately suppressed or forgotten. But this was the new world. Luther's friends and supporters saw the power of his arguments. They took his Latin text, translated it into common German, and brought it to a printer. The spark had met the gunpowder. What was meant to be a whisper inside a university became a roar that crossed Europe in a matter of weeks, igniting the fires of the Reformation. The challenge from Rome was met not with armies or assassins, but with a strategic counteroffensive waged on paper. Luther's theses and his subsequent explosive writings were translated from academic Latin into common German. They were then printed not as expensive books, but as cheap, single-sheet pamphlets, easily folded and passed from hand to hand. Within weeks, his ideas had saturated the towns and cities of the Holy Roman Empire, a velocity of dissemination that was previously unimaginable. This was the dawn of the world's first true information war. The battlefield was the public mind, and the weapon was the affordable, mass-produced text. For every papal bull, the official edicts from Rome, condemning Luther, his supporters could print and distribute thousands of counter-arguments, complete with woodcut illustrations mocking the Pope. The Church, accustomed to a monopoly on truth that moved at the speed of a walking monk, was suddenly outmaneuvered by an opponent who moved at the speed of the press. The ultimate consequence was a fundamental shift in the location of debate. For the first time in 1,000 years, complex theological ideas, which had been the exclusive property of a highly educated, Latin-speaking clergy, were now being discussed by merchants in their guild halls, by artisans in their workshops, and by farmers in the marketplace. The gatekeepers of knowledge had lost the gate, but the most devastating strategic move was yet to come. Luther undertook the monumental task of translating the New Testament into German. This act did more than simply challenge a specific doctrine. It was a direct assault on the very foundation of the Church's power. It severed the institution's role as the sole, necessary interpreter of divine will, the one conduit through which Scripture could be understood by the masses. The power of this act cannot be overstated. An individual, for the first time, could read the sacred texts for themselves in their own language. This created a direct, unmediated relationship with their faith. Authority was no longer exclusively external, handed down from a distant pope in Rome. It could now be internal, found within the conscience of the individual reader. A new kind of human was being forged, one who could challenge the highest powers on earth based on personal conviction. To understand the cataclysm that followed, one must picture the world before this moment. Pre-Gutenberg Europe, for all its political diversity, shared a single, unified reality. It was a cosmos defined, policed, and explained by one institution, the Catholic Church. From the nature of salvation to the movement of the stars, there was one official truth. The printing press shattered that shared reality. Once the Bible was open to individual interpretation, a fatal question arose. If any literate person could decide what the text meant, who was to say which interpretation was correct? The single unified truth of Christendom fractured into dozens, then hundreds of competing realities, each backed by its own printed justifications and theological proofs. This was not a peaceful academic disagreement. The collapse of a shared reality led directly to a century of brutal, devastating religious warfare. If your neighbor's interpretation of Scripture threatened your own eternal salvation, compromise was not an option. From the fields of Germany to the cities of France, entire societies tore themselves apart, fighting and dying to impose their printed version of the truth upon everyone else. Yet this revolution had consequences that even its architect could not control. Luther himself was horrified when German peasants, inspired by his message of spiritual freedom and individual conscience, took his ideas to their logical conclusion. They used printed pamphlets to organize a massive uprising in 1524, demanding not just religious reform but social and economic freedom from the oppressive nobility. The great rebel, who had defied Pope and Emperor, now saw his own weapons turned against the social order he supported. Faced with a revolution that went too far, Luther furiously denounced the peasants. He wrote pamphlets of his own, urging the German princes to crush the rebellion without mercy. He who had unleashed the power of uncontrolled information discovered a terrifying truth. It is a power that, once released, answers to no single master. From the ashes of one universal authority, two new powers began to rise, each fueled by the engine of the press. Ambitious princes and kings, long constrained by the Church's continental reach, saw their opportunity. They used printed decrees and Bibles, translated into the common tongues of their people, to forge new identities. No longer just Christians, people began to see themselves as French or English or German. The press became the primary tool for building the nation-state, a new kind of power structure built on shared language and culture, all centered on the singular authority of a monarch. Simultaneously, another borderless kingdom was being born. Scholars, once isolated by distance and the scarcity of texts, now formed a great republic of letters. Thinkers like Erasmus in Rotterdam could debate with Thomas More in London, their arguments and discoveries printed, circulated, and critiqued across Europe in months, not decades. This was the birth of modern science and philosophy, a collaborative enterprise built on the free and rapid exchange of information, a power based not on territory or divine right, but on verifiable truth and intellectual merit. This entire saga, the collapse of a central authority and the violent creative chaos that followed, is more than just history. It is a blueprint. The story of the printing press is the essential pattern for understanding our own time, a perfect historical echo of the digital revolution. For 500 years, a new set of gatekeepers, major newspapers, broadcast networks, and publishing houses curated a shared, stable reality. They decided what was news, which ideas were legitimate, and who was given a voice. The dynamics of this transformation are identical. A centralized, top-down information system built to ensure stability and control was suddenly shattered by a new, decentralized technology that offered a direct voice to the masses. The high priests of the old order, whether in the Vatican or in a television newsroom, found their authority challenged not by a rival power, but by a million scattered voices. The printing press allowed one man's protest to be heard by a continent. The internet allows any individual's thought to reach the entire globe in an instant. The consequences, too, are the same. We live again in an age of profound ideological conflict, a time when the very concept of a shared truth is under assault. New political tribes form online, armed with their own facts and their own profits, leading to a fracturing of society that mirrors the religious wars of the 16th and 17th centuries. The power to define reality has once again been torn from the hands of the few and scattered among the many, with world-altering results. Picture for a moment the immense historical weight of Martin Luther's stand. A single determined monk, armed with a powerful new machine for replicating ideas, fundamentally broke the spiritual and political unity of a 1,000-year-old civilization. His 95 theses were not merely a challenge. They were a declaration that one man's conscience, amplified by technology, could defy an empire. And this reveals the central paradox of our modern age. If one Martin Luther with a printing press could destabilize an entire continent and redraw the map of power, what happens when billions of people are armed with a global, instantaneous publishing platform in their pockets? What is the consequence when there are not one but a billion Luthers, each broadcasting their own truths, their own revelations, and their own calls to action every single day? The answer is that the technology itself is not the true agent of change. It is only a catalyst, an amplifier for the deepest, most enduring human impulses. The medium evolves, from a hand-copied scroll in a silent monastery, to the clattering metal type of Gutenberg's workshop, to the silent, pulsing light of fiber-optic cables spanning the ocean floor. But the fundamental struggle remains unchanged. It is the eternal contest between the centralized structures that seek to create order and consensus, and the decentralized forces that empower individual freedom and dissent. It is the unending war over the most potent source of power in human civilization, the authority to define reality itself. This conflict did not begin with the printing press, and it will not end with the internet. It is the deep, rhythmic pulse of history, a recurring battle between the desire for a unified world and the uncontainable power of the human voice unleashed.